Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our next episode of Sundata TV. Today, we're looking at the world of Linux workloads in 2020 and the sorts of trends that we're seeing in that space across the marketplace. Pleasure to introduce two guests today. I have Martin Zira, who's the director of the IBM Synergy team within Red Hat in Australia. And I'm going to ask Martin to expand on that role in a moment. And I've also got David Cole from Sundata, who's a sales specialist who focuses on the IBM Power platform. And we're seeing a greater proportion of Linux workloads being deployed on Power in 2020. And so we'll have a handful of questions for these gentlemen and a conversation. Hopefully can shed some light on the open source world. And this is not a technical geeky conversation. This is more about business implications for IT strategies in 2020. So, Martin, if I could just throw to you and ask you to expand upon your role within Red Hat. Thank you.
Pleasure to be on Sundata TV. The role that I've taken on at the beginning of this year in January is basically to help with the integration of the two companies, Red Hat and IBM, after the acquisition. As you can imagine, IBM has got lots of different varying businesses, also lots of different sales teams. And my job is to help with the integration, making sure that also the messaging across the sales teams is understood, and we're taking our key solutions to market. And the second part of my role is to continue to preserve Red Hat's autonomy, because it was a clear decision from both companies to keep Red Hat separate. We've got a very vibrant partner ecosystem that we want to protect, and our customers also relish the relationship that they have and had with Red Hat, particularly also the access to the large open source community.
Thank you, Martin. Certainly, I guess over the last 8 or 10 years, the open source at Red Hat in particular has come a very long way in terms of being a corporate enterprise platform that's got a much broader role in the industry than it did, if you like, 10 years ago. So we really appreciate your insights today. So for our first, I guess, topic point, I would like to ask the question about what sort of trends are we seeing in terms of migrating workloads to Linux, to the Red Hat environment in 2020, and how has that changed over the last couple of years? So I might throw to Martin for the start of that one. Thanks, Martin.
Thank you, Con. Well, over the last couple of years, we've seen the trend continuing that we've seen probably since I've been with the company over the last 15 years, a trend away from proprietary systems, and that would be proprietary Unix systems. There is also a move towards hybrid cloud that we see, where customers have obviously been experimenting, moving workloads into clouds. And that also led to the containerization of workloads. Now with the availability of all of those open source development frameworks, you can also see a lot of customers are currently modernizing their entire application environment. Some of them are going onto SaaS platforms, otherwise are going into microservices type environments where they can still control it. So we see these trends, and the beauty of those trends that we see is that all of that is underpinned by a couple of major movements. So Linux as the default operating system moving forward. So if we look at the number of operating systems that are currently still relevant in the market, we probably only have got 2, Windows and Linux. And Linux is the fastest growing. So if you look into all the different providers that are currently offering workloads, Linux is the fastest growing. And also, as I said, underlying to that is then basically the software stack that sits on top of that, and all the open source frameworks that the developers are using to take new software solutions as well as turn their existing applications more modern. And it requires that framework that we're providing with Linux to basically run that moving forward.
So thank you, Martin. So is the business case then really about that technical layer, about taking advantage of containerization, or are there business elements that you're seeing in the rationale to migrate to a Linux environment?
I think it's a bit of both ultimately, because obviously we've got also two factions that we see with our customers. You obviously have got the developers and the people that are looking after the applications, but then you've also got the operations people and the business folk that obviously need to make sure that they get certain applications and services quickly to market, but they also need to protect the company and make sure that everything is continuously up and running. So when we see those trends, then you have to have an opportunity to make sure that you find a balance between those two, let's call them teams that are, battling it out to say, okay, can we move fast enough? But how do we move fast enough without, jeopardizing the security of our business?
Look, that's actually a point we'll come back to in a moment about the maturity of these environments. David, could I ask you what you're seeing, if you like, at the individual client level that we engage with at Sundata, about people's appetite and plans for either moving existing workloads to Linux by way of migration or deploying new applications and solutions in a Linux context?
Yeah, I guess what we're seeing here in the Australian market, and also I guess at a lower level the Queensland market, is a lot of organisations have sort of shifted from having Linux as a specific application operating system. So they might have bought 10, 15 years ago, bought a specific application and it just happened to run on Linux. That was the ISV's platform of choice. So we saw a bit of growth around a specific application within organisations, and that's now shifted to, I guess, a more dynamic deployment with Linux, and that's being driven not only by the containerization type capabilities of the operating systems, but also just the dynamic nature of cloud, be it total public cloud or hybrid cloud, being able to just spin up environments and expand and shrink workloads as required. And that's where we're seeing a lot more development effort going in these days, where people are running new applications and making those a dynamic layer.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So the scale up and scale down in an agile way type solution.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a platform that really is being designed and is driving that agile nature of IT these days.
Okay. I'll just pick up on a comment that you made, Martin. I know that you've got IBM mainframe and IBM Power in your background, and certainly I have as well, and David has. I know an argument, we've seen the different waves of trends over the years, but an argument for longer standing environments is that they're stable and they're mature and they're trustworthy. And certainly IBM buying Red Hat was seen as a very big bet on Linux as a platform for the cloud. Where is Linux and where is Red Hat at in 2020 in terms of being a rock solid platform for corporate enterprise government workloads?
Well, it is a very large question, but I'm happy to report from our side that as you said, like for the last, I'd say, 10 years, we've clearly proven that Linux is enterprise ready with all the support that is available around it, the innovation that goes into the platform from the hundreds of thousands of developers that are helping us. We have got pretty much, if you look at the top 500 in the US, or you look at the top customers here in Australia that we have, there are all the key names for all the key verticals that are all using and relying on Linux as the core application delivery platform, I'd say, the core base of it, right? Then how they are deploying the applications, is it on-premise, is it a mixture of hybrid cloud or multi-cloud, is a different story. But I think there's no doubts anymore that Linux has come a very, very long way. It's being accepted by the enterprise, and to me now it's also the de facto standard moving forward. Yep,
understood. I guess our experience with individual clients is that we still do see older Linux deployments that go back to the days when it was a Linux effectively an appliance, because that's what the software vendor specified. and we're seeing older systems that are, if you like, isolated and unpatched and things like that. Is there a pathway for people like that who've got those sorts of deployments to get up to date in 2020 in a non-disruptive fashion?
Absolutely, and I think nothing has changed in terms of the migration path. And I've been doing migrations even since before I joined Red Hat, because in the old days we had Intel starting to really commoditize, I'd say the workload space in the early 2000s, and there was still a combination with a large database vendor at the time that basically started moving all their workloads onto Linux, and SAP followed promptly. And the closeness of existing Unix systems to Linux, because they're not too far off from each other, makes a migration relatively easy. If it's an off-the-shelf application, we have a lot of ISVs that are basically making their versions of their software available for both platforms. So migration could be as easy as an export-import. In other cases, if you've got applications that are written in specific languages, it probably requires a bit more thinking and planning to migrate. But helping customers to migrate from a proprietary, older style platform onto Linux these days is pretty straightforward. And we've got lots and lots of partners. It goes back to that part of the ecosystem that is specializing. The tooling has come a long, long way. In the old days, it was pretty much all proprietary, and you had to pay a lot of money for the migration itself. These days, automated toolings, particularly also, again, dipping into the open source community, there's heaps and heaps of analysis tools in terms of, particularly when you migrate Java applications, it's very, very straightforward. And we, together with our partners such as Sundata, can certainly help.
Thanks, Martin. Look, I know, just to follow on from that, I know hardware is probably the least sexy topic in IT, but I know in the Linux space that we have, the options of x86, we have the options of IBM Power, and we have the options of the IBM Z series for our American listeners, the mainframe technology. Maybe I could ask you both to consider, what are the pros and cons of those platforms if you were looking at consolidating, modernizing, integrating workloads into a Linux environment? David, would you like to kick off from a power perspective?
Yeah, well, I guess you've mentioned the three core options there, and I guess the Intel server is the default. It's the starting point. Everybody's got Intel, and so it's relatively commoditized, easy to deploy, and it just doesn't require too much thinking as to what the platform needs to be. At the other end of the scale, you've got mainframe, the Z series, and it's interesting, IBM have I believe selling more mainframes these days to be dedicated Linux servers at the top end of town than they are for the traditional mainframe market. Power Systems then sits in the middle of that, and it's, I guess it's not seen as the default option for a lot of clients, especially those that may not have Power Systems in their current hardware stack. But it's seen as expensive, legacy, AS400 type heritage of the platform. But if you actually look at it as a Linux platform, then the advantages are quite strong. In the performance per core is traditionally always been greater than x86. Generally approximately 2 times per. Performance per core, the number of containers that you can run, the TCO, and the reliability of Power brings it to the fore. So if you look at the cost of acquisition and the cost of ownership, Power is quite a competitive platform to run Linux workloads.
Thanks, David. Martin, if I could ask you, if you were talking hypothetically about somebody considering a HANA project, for example, and what are the sorts of things that would point them towards one platform or another as the right platform for their Red Hat environment?
Well, the first question obviously would be, is the application or the ISV available on a very specific platform? And in SAP's case, that's pretty clear. SAP has now basically announced that by 2027, all the HANA stuff needs to run on Linux, and they've also clearly said they would continue to support the existing platforms that they are supporting on Linux, which is fantastic. When customers are looking into deploying SAP in particular, we've got a very good example here in Australia recently where a customer, interestingly enough, had an outsourced SAP installation on the public cloud. They were very unhappy with some of the performance, also the requirements in terms of paying for data in, data out for certain use cases, and also a bit of an opaque billing system at the very end. So one of our partners here down south in Melbourne helped us to basically migrate that back on premise. And it's now running on IBM Power. I think it's going to be a case study very shortly. It's in the industrial space. And it goes to show that specific workloads, also when you look at platforms such as the Power Platform, and I've learned a lot since I've started really working very, very closely again with the systems group in January this year. The amount of work that's gone in, again, the relationship between IBM and Red Hat has been very, very close for almost 20 years. And the co-development of Linux on Power and Linux on Z has been making great progress over that time frame. And so Linux is very well adapted, is making use of all the features that the platform is bringing to bear. You can address very, very large memory spaces. It's very fast. And yeah, we see a lot of the customers that have been making choices over the last couple of years and have been, as I said, experimenting with moving certain workloads in the cloud for various reasons, which include, as I mentioned earlier, performance, but also licensing and the proximity to data. That is, in a lot of cases, particularly when you look at large-scale SAP implementation required, will lend itself to really look closely to say, what is my best platform? And that's where we want to give customers the choice to say a hybrid option where you have got specific workloads depending on their requirements, either on-premise or somewhere else, is probably the best option. And Power, to me, particularly for customers that have got a large fleet that they're already using, is a perfect way of creating a very, very highly secure on-premise private cloud environment using Linux and potentially OpenShift as a container platform to provide an enterprise class application delivery.
Well, there's a lot to unpack in that.
Sorry.
I think no, I appreciate it. And I guess part of the challenge in the Australia, New Zealand context is that we don't have the volume of use cases and testimonials that you might have, say, for example, in the US or Europe. So the example that you just gave in Melbourne probably encapsulates a lot of what a typical business case to deploy Linux on Power looks like. So there are things that David alluded to, like the performance per core is generally superior to an x86 environment. The cost of ownership is lower if you take into account not just the purchase price, but then what's it going to cost to operate, what's it going to cost to administer. The reliability of the Power Platform is demonstrably superior in terms of outage times for a given period. I guess the old days of saying, well, you know, for example, Red Hat is going to be more up-to-date or more modern on x86 compared to Power or mainframe, those days are gone, because the platforms are basically all created equal from in point of view of what functionality is available. So there is a lot in the business case. It is hard to find, and it's not extremely well promoted. That's part of the reason for this conversation today. So I'll just move on a little bit further, because this is part of our idea of Sundata TV, is to talk about issues, not just about, if you like, the evaluation and procurement of technology, but also what is it like to live with. And one thing that is the case with proprietary environments, particularly in Unix like AIX or Solaris and things like that, is skills. And I guess from where I sit, the availability of skills in Linux is far superior to the proprietary environments. Martin, have you got an observation that you might want to add on that?
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, I mean, you said the skills in Linux are vast, and I think thanks to Red Hat, because that's one of our key pillars or business pillars is the training. and also the certification is very, very sought after in the industry. I think given the way how Linux, as an example, is now integrated into IBM's platforms in Power in particular, it is not a huge leap for existing IBM trained people to also, become very, very familiar with Linux on Power. So I think it's not going to be a huge step. And we've seen lots and lots of our customers that had large scale Unix platforms in the past. They've had a sometimes multi-month, multi-year program to get their staff retrained, and the step between Unix and Linux is not that great. So I wouldn't be too worried about deploying a Power-based platform. You can still, particularly when you run Linux at the core of it, to utilize the skills that you have available. And I think another advantage that we've seen is customers, when you come back to what you mentioned earlier around the desire to migrate and modernize applications, you will have the capability to run existing workloads that are running on AIX or even some of the iSeries apps to basically run them in parallel on the same system that you're running Linux on Power. I think this is, again, one of the other advantages that I see in the platform that some of the other options can't provide.
Yeah, that's a good point. David, did you want to comment just firstly on that hosting multiple workloads on a Power platform across different OSs?
Yeah, for existing Power clients, that's a really compelling discussion to have, because if we do see a lot of clients that still run old applications, and these could be written in RPG or even some COBOL out there, which are really efficient applications to run on the Power platform. We have a lot of clients that might use a single CPU core for their ERP application. Now, you can't buy a one-core server these days, obviously. We're seeing people buying systems that might have 6 or 8 cores at that smaller end, which is a lot of capacity, but they're barely touching the sides of the first core. So that leaves the other 5/6 of that machine available for other workloads. And you already own the infrastructure, so it certainly makes sense to consider putting more workloads onto that system to take advantage of the capacity that you've already paid for. And putting a Red Hat workload sitting next to your AIX or your iSeries workload is quite a compelling discussion, and the business case is incredibly strong.
Yeah, it's something that we see quite often is an underutilized Power platform in an environment, as you say, because they do pack a lot of performance into a small footprint, and they're quite happy running their IBM I or their AIX workload on a subset of capacity. And in the same rack or the rack next door is a bunch of Intel equipment running Red Hat or running Linux workloads, and that can certainly be consolidated into that Power without any extra cost of acquisition or maintenance. And from a skills point of view, it's Linux inside a partition, and your Linux admin skills will work just fine. David, did you have any comment on the skills side of things from what you see?
Well, yeah, the skills certainly for Linux is becoming more commonplace. So we're seeing operators these days and uni graduates coming into IT. They've either got very strong skills coming out of university, or they've had their own little side projects at home, and they run those on Linux because you can just download a community version and not pay anything for it, which is obviously the objective of any uni student, to not pay for anything. So people are coming into their careers with some sort of Linux skills. As Martin said, Red Hat specifically have a lot of investment in the training and certification for operations staff, but we are seeing that it's very rare someone comes into their IT career, or even older IT professionals, that do not have any Linux experience.
Yeah, I think you tippy-toed around the age subject there, but certainly in the community, skills for the proprietary Unix or for IBM I, the average age of somebody skilled is typically a lot older than the average Linux trained engineer. And I'd certainly reiterate what you said, is that we are seeing people coming into the industry and they've had a Linux environment in their bedroom at home running media or something since they were 14. and so they're hitting their stride in their 20s with some years of Linux experience. Technically, certainly not ITIL certified or robust in terms of processes and things like that, but certainly they've got a very strong platform to build up on. So that's another question in terms of deployment and choice of platform for workloads. And I guess that's also part of the big bet that IBM made in acquiring Red Hat. And I can tell from Martin's comments that, having seen IBM do lots of acquisitions over the years, I can see a lot of signs that IBM has taken the Red Hat one to another level in terms of maximising the benefit of the acquisition. So I think that might be our agenda for today. Martin, were there any closing comments you'd like to make before we finish off?
I think I'm good from my side. Really wanted to thank you for having me on Sundata TV today. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I look forward to working closer with you moving forward.
Thank you, Martin. It's been a pleasure to have you and to hear your insights. David, any comments you'd like to finish off with? Anything about this?
Yeah, the only thing I would add, some of the things that we've referred to around the reliability and the performance of these machines, we'll have in the comments just a link to a couple of independent reports that have been conducted over the last few years on platform comparisons around those reliability statements.
Thanks, David. As I said, it sometimes is hard to find use cases and testimonials around this area. So if you are looking for those sorts of assets and you can't find them, please reach out to David or Martin or myself, and we'll certainly help point you in the right direction. So thank you for your attention again today, and we look forward to seeing you on our next episode. Thank you.